You might think that diagnosing a broken roof is as simple as diagnosing a broken arm. You look for the crack, you point to it, and you're basically done.
Right.
But welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a stack of forensic engineering guidelines.
Right, specifically a very meticulous, highly structured 10-step framework designed by Ray Gessner.
Yeah, to show you why inspecting storm damage is, frankly, a high-stakes crime scene investigation.
It really is. I mean, the stakes are just incredibly high. We are talking about millions and sometimes, billions of dollars in property damage claims following a major weather event.
Wow, yeah.
And when those sums are on the line, you just cannot rely on a quick glance and a guess. You need a methodology that, it strips away human bias entirely and replaces it with defensible scientific evidence.
Exactly. And to give you, the listener, some context here, Ray Gessner is a PE. Wait, let's define that right off the bat. But PE stands for professional engineer, right? That's not just some fancy marketing title.
Oh,
Okay,
no.
let's unpack this. Because reading through Gessner's methodology, I realized just how incredibly complex the physical environment of your house really is.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you've ever had someone knock on your front door after a thunderstorm offering a free roof inspection, they probably just threw a ladder against your gutters, climbed up, and started looking for missing shingles.
Yeah, which is a massive rookie mistake.
Right. This framework insists that jumping straight onto the roof is just the wrong move.
It is the absolute fastest way to compromise an investigation.
Why is that?
Well, if you go straight to the shingles, your observations are completely untethered from reality. You are looking at a highly complex, degrading material without any baseline whatsoever.
Because shingles just get old, right?
Exactly. You might find a mark, but what caused it? Was it a hailstone,
Yeah.
a falling tree branch, or, a roofer's hammer from 10 years ago? To figure that out, you have to establish a chronological and spatial context first.
So if the house is the crime scene, where does the investigation actually start?
It starts before you even arrive at the property.
Really?
Yeah, it starts with historical meteorology. The very first objective is to identify the reported event. You have to know the specific date, or at least a very tight window of dates, when the homeowner or the insurance company believes the damage occurred.
Because if you don't have a date, you are just guessing in the dark. I was looking at the methodology, and it brings up the need to pull storm reports, local weather history, radar data. You need to know not just that it stormed, but what kind of storm it was.
Precisely. What was the time of day? How long did the intense weather last? Did the National Weather Service report severe hail, or was it just high winds? And perhaps most importantly, what was the direction the storm was traveling?
I want to stop on that because directionality just blew my mind. Why does it matter if a storm came from the northwest or the south? I mean, the house is sitting in the exact same spot regardless.
Well, what's fascinating here is how directionality interacts with the three-dimensional geometry of a structure.
Okay.
A storm system is a moving force. Let's say a severe thunderstorm is tracking from the northwest to the southeast. That means the wind-driven rain, the flying debris, and the hail are going to impact the north and west-facing exterior walls.
Oh, right.
And those specific roof slopes of that house are going to get hit with immense kinetic energy.
So they are essentially standing right in the firing line.
Exactly. And conversely, the south and east-facing slopes are shielded. They are on the leeward side. So if you don't know the storm's direction of travel before you start your physical inspection,
You have no idea where to look.
right, you have no baseline expectation for where the damage should logically be concentrated.
That is wild.
Okay.
So you arrive at the house, you've done your meteorological homework, and you know a storm came barreling in from the west. You still aren't getting on the roof, though. The framework says you start with site orientation. You literally stand in the yard with a compass.
Or a smartphone, or even a printed satellite image of the property. But yes, you must explicitly establish true north.
Just to get your bearings.
More than that, you document the orientation of the front door, and then you systematically label every single slope of the roof: north, south, east, west.
It seems so basic, though.
It seems basic, but in a court of law, if an engineer mixes up the west slope and the east slope in their photographs, the entire report can be thrown out.
Wow. So you are building an undeniable record of reality. And while you are standing in the yard, you're also profiling the roof system itself, right? Assessing what kind of shingles it has. I know there are different types, but how does that actually change the investigation?
It changes the entire physics of failure.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The two most common types of asphalt shingles are 3-tab and architectural. 3-tab shingles are, they are a single flat layer of asphalt and fiberglass. They have these cutouts that make them look like three separate blocks.
Okay, I can picture those,
They are relatively thin and lightweight.
which means they probably don't handle wind very well.
They're highly susceptible to certain aerodynamic uplift forces, yes. But on the other hand, architectural shingles, which are also known as laminated or dimensional shingles, they are manufactured with multiple layers of material bonded together.
So they're beefier.
Much beefier. They're significantly heavier, thicker, and present a completely different aerodynamic profile to the wind. An engineer has to note this because, say, a 60-mile-per-hour wind might absolutely devastate a 3-tab roof.
But leave the architectural roof totally fine.
Completely untouched. And age plays into this, too.
Right, a 15-year-old roof baking in the Texas sun is going to behave differently than a roof installed last week in Minnesota.
Absolutely. Asphalt is basically a petrochemical product. Over time, ultraviolet radiation from the sun bakes out the volatile oils, the plasticizers we call them.
The stuff that makes it bendy.
Exactly, the oils that keep the asphalt flexible. A brand new shingle is pliable. If a piece of hail hits it, it can flex, absorb the kinetic energy, and just rebound,
Like a trampoline.
basically. But an older roof becomes rigid. It gets brittle. It completely loses its ability to flex.
So the exact same hailstone could harmlessly bounce off my neighbor's new roof, but completely shatter the shingles on my older roof.
Precisely. Which is exactly why generalized statements like, the hail wasn't big enough to cause damage, are inherently flawed.
Because they don't account for the roof's age.
Right. If they don't account for the material condition of the specific roof being inspected, it's just bad engineering.
I love how this is coming together. You're establishing the suspect profile, basically. But the framework points out something else you have to evaluate from the yard, and this really surprised me, the trees. You have to look at the landscaping.
Oh, the environment is critical. If we connect this to the bigger picture of fluid dynamics, the surrounding environment dictates the actual forces the house experiences.
Give me an example.
Imagine a house situated in the middle of a dense, mature oak forest. Those massive trees act as a chaotic filter for the wind. They break up the airflow, absorb the energy, and create all this massive turbulence.
They're basically a giant windbreak for the house.
Exactly. So the wind speeds that actually reach the roof of that house are drastically lower than the wind speeds recorded by a weather station out at the local airport.
Ah, that makes sense.
If an engineer walks up to a house surrounded by 60-foot oak trees and finds catastrophic uniform wind damage across the entire roof, that is an immediate red flag.
The physics don't align with the environment.
Exactly. The wind couldn't have hit it that hard.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following this. The trees block the wind, but what about hail? Trees don't stop ice falling from the sky, do they?
Well, only partially. Hail falls largely vertically or, at a steep angle depending on the wind.
Yeah.
A house shielded by trees might have absolutely zero wind damage because of that windbreak effect.
Right.
But it could still suffer catastrophic hail damage because the hail just plummets straight down through the gaps in the canopy.
Wow. So you could have two totally different outcomes on the exact same house.
Yeah.
And what if the house is out on an open prairie? No trees, no neighbors, just flat land.
Then the house is taking the full unobstructed impact of the weather. We call that laminar flow.
Laminar flow. Okay, what is that?
It's wind that is moving in smooth, parallel layers without being chopped up or slowed down by obstacles. When laminar flow hits a house, the aerodynamic uplift forces generated on the roof edges are exponentially higher.
Laminar flow, so it's just like a solid invisible wall of air hitting the house.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've profiled the neighborhood, the trees, the roof type, the age, the compass directions. The framework says the next move is a slow, deliberate walk around the entire perimeter of the house.
Yes, you are looking for collateral damage. You inspect the gutters, the downspouts, the window screens, the siding, the air conditioning unit, even the painted wood of the fences.
But why? I mean, if the homeowner filed a claim for their roof, why is the highly trained engineer staring at a dent in an aluminum downspout near the ground?
Because you are gathering physical evidence to build a working hypothesis.
A hypothesis.
Right. Weather is hyperlocal. A radar image might show a massive red blob of severe weather covering your entire zip code.
Sure, you see that on the news all the time.
But within that red blob, a severe hail core, the specific column of air dropping the really destructive ice might only be a quarter mile wide.
That's small.
Yes, it could literally destroy the roof on a house down the street and completely miss your house.
Oh, wow. So just because it stormed in my town doesn't mean it actually stormed on my specific address.
Precisely. You need site-specific proof. If you just climb onto the roof, the asphalt shingles are incredibly difficult to read. They degrade naturally.
I think get brittle.
But an aluminum downspout is simple. It doesn't degrade in a way that mimics an impact. If you find hail dents on the west-facing gutters, the west-facing window screens, and the west-facing siding.
Now you have a pattern.
Exactly. You have a working hypothesis. A hailstorm absolutely struck this physical address, and it was driven by wind from the west.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah.
It prevents you from just seeing what you want to see once you get up high on the roof. You are anchoring your expectations in ground-level reality. But let's talk about how you find those dents, because the methodology gets incredibly specific here. It talks about light angles and, of all things, sidewalk chalk.
Yes, this is a staple technique in forensic engineering.
Walk me through it.
Let's say a piece of hail hits a white aluminum downspout. It leaves a very shallow, sweeping indentation. If you walk up to that downspout at noon on a perfectly sunny day and look at it straight on, you will likely see nothing.
Because it's too bright.
The glare washes out the surface imperfections. Our human eyes rely on shadows to perceive depth.
It's like trying to see craters on the moon during a full moon. It just looks like a bright, flat disk.
Yeah.
You need the shadows of a crescent moon to actually see the texture.
That is a brilliant analogy. Yes, exactly like that. So an engineer will intentionally position themselves so they are looking across the surface of the metal at a very low oblique angle.
To go grazing it with their eyes.
Right. They use the ambient light to catch the lip of any indentation, which casts a shadow inside the dent.
But what if it's an overcast day? Or what if the dent is so shallow the light just doesn't catch it at all? The framework mentions taking out a piece of chalk.
If the visual evidence isn't clear enough to photograph, you use chalk. You take a standard piece of large sidewalk chalk, hold it completely flat against the metal, and just lightly rub it over the suspected impact area.
Just dragging it sideways across the surface.
Exactly sideways.
Yeah.
Because you're holding it flat, the chalk only makes contact with the high spots of the metal. It bridges right over the indentation. So what you are left with is the natural, unchalked color of the downspout, perfectly outlining the shape of the dent, surrounded by a faint dusting of chalk. Suddenly, an invisible impact is starkly revealed. You can see its exact diameter, its shape, and its depth profile.
Okay, I have to push back here.
Yeah.
Because if you do that on my gutters, and a little unchalked circle appears, how do you know a piece of ice did that?
What do you mean?
Well, what if I had someone over last fall to clean my gutters, and they leaned a really heavy extension ladder against the metal? Or what if my kids were throwing a baseball against the side of the house? How do we differentiate storm damage from just, life?
This raises an important question, and it's the exact question an engineer must ask at every single data point. The answer lies in geometry and pattern recognition.
Geometry.
Let's break down your examples. A ladder has two rigid, straight rails. If someone leans a heavy ladder against an aluminum gutter, the force is distributed along those straight lines.
Okay.
It crushes the metal inward, leaving a linear crease or a sharp, continuous bend.
It folds the metal rather than denting it like a bowl.
Right. Now, what about a baseball? A baseball is spherical, so it will leave a rounded dent. But a kid throwing a baseball is going to leave one, maybe two isolated dents, highly concentrated in an area where kids play.
Right, like near the driveway or the back patio.
Exactly. So how does hail look different? Hail is also roughly spherical, leaving rounded, relatively smooth, saucer-like indentations. But hail does not fall in isolation.
It falls by the thousands.
Exactly. The defining forensic signature of hail is a random, widespread distribution of rounded impacts.
A scattershot pattern.
Yes, a scattershot pattern.
Yeah.
If I find a single dent near your back door, I am highly skeptical of hail.
Sure.
But if I find a random distribution of 20 rounded dents on the front gutters, 30 on the back downspouts, tears in the window screens on the second story, and impact marks on the metal chimney cap, human error cannot explain that pattern.
The consistency across all those different materials and elevations proves it was a massive meteorological event.
Exactly.
You mentioned window screens. The framework highlights those as key evidence.
Yeah.
You're looking for random punctures or distortions in the mesh, right?
Yes, and again, you are looking for randomness. If you see a long, straight tear in a screen, that implies a sharp object is dragged across it, perhaps a tree branch or a tool.
Something human or mechanical.
Right. Hail creates localized circular stretching or small punctures where the kinetic energy of the ice pushes straight through the fragile fiberglass or aluminum mesh.
And you check the siding, the fascia boards, feeling for chips in the paint. Wait, define fascia for me, just so we have the anatomy of the house completely clear.
The fascia is the long, straight board that runs along the lower edge of the roof. It's the board that your gutters are typically attached to.
Oh, okay, so it faces straight outward.
Yes. Often, it's covered in a thin wrapping of aluminum or vinyl to protect the wood. Because it's a vertical surface, it's a prime target for wind-driven hail.
Got it. Now, as you're doing this perimeter walk, the framework spends a significant amount of time talking about the air conditioning condenser unit, the HVAC unit sitting outside.
Yes.
Why is a piece of machinery so crucial to a roof inspection?
What's fascinating about those outdoor AC units is that they are essentially the perfect unintentional hail impact sensors.
How so?
Think about how they are built. The outer casing has grills, and inside those grills are the condenser coils. Those coils are surrounded by thousands of incredibly thin, delicate aluminum fins.
They look like tiny radiator fins.
Yeah.
They're designed to transfer heat out of the system, right?
Yes, and to transfer heat efficiently, they must be extremely thin and malleable. Because they are so fragile, they record almost every single impact with incredibly high fidelity.
Like a sponge for damage.
Precisely. An engineer will shine a flashlight through the protective grille and look for areas where those vertical fins have been smashed flat.
And you can actually measure those flattened spots to figure out how big the hail was?
You can. You measure the width of the damaged fin area, and it gives you a surprisingly accurate lower bound estimate of the hailstone's diameter.
Lower bound.
Yes. If the fins are crushed in a circle that is 3/4 of an inch wide, a hailstone at least that large hit the unit.
I know the framework has a whole section on the advanced statistics and the massive errors people make when evaluating those AC fins, and we are absolutely going to dive deep into that math later. It's wild.
Yeah.
But for now, we've walked the perimeter.
Yes.
We've chalked the gutters, checked the screens, measured the AC fins. We have a solid working hypothesis that a storm hit this house from a specific direction. Now, do we finally get the ladder off the truck?
Now, ensuring you have a safe access plan, checking the pitch of the roof, looking for dangerous power lines, ensuring the surface isn't slippery, you finally climb the ladder.
Okay, we're on the roof. I'm immediately looking at the shingles.
And you would be making a huge mistake.
Seriously, still no shingles.
Still no shingles. Once an engineer transitions to the roof, they conduct the roof-level soft metal inspection.
Okay, what is that?
They go straight past the asphalt and head directly for the ridge vents, the plumbing exhaust pipes, the chimney flashings, and the attic ventilators.
The soft metals. Why are we actively ignoring the main surface of the roof? I mean, that's what we're there to inspect.
Because, as we discussed earlier, asphalt is noisy data. It blisters from heat. It loses its ceramic granules just from normal rain. It cracks as the house shifts.
Right.
Deciphering storm damage from natural aging on an asphalt shingle is very complex and subjective. Soft metals, however, are completely objective.
How so?
A galvanized steel pipe jack, which is just the metal flashing that seals the plumbing pipes sticking out of your roof, does not degrade in a way that looks like an impact.
It's the lie detector. If hail hit the roof, it had to hit the metal.
Precisely. The soft metals act as a pristine recording medium. You apply that exact same chalking technique we used on the gutters. You lightly rub chalk over the tops of the vents to reveal the indentations. And this is where the forensic analysis gets incredibly granular. You don't just count the dents, you analyze their size distribution.
Because a natural storm is chaotic. It doesn't manufacture identical ice cubes.
Exactly. A single severe thunderstorm is a violent, churning updraft of air. It drops pea-sized hail, marble-sized hail, and perhaps a few larger stones all simultaneously.
Right.
If an engineer chalks a roof vent and sees 50 dents that are all perfectly identical, say exactly 1/2 inch in diameter,
Right.
with absolutely no variation, that is a massive red flag.
Wait, you mean like someone faked it?
Yes. Fraud is an unfortunate reality in the property claims industry. Mechanical damage, like someone striking the vent repeatedly with a ball-peen hammer to manufacture an insurance claim, often lacks the random size distribution of a natural event.
Yeah.
A human arm swinging a hammer tends to strike with very consistent force, leaving uniform marks. A natural hail distribution will always show a range of sizes.
That is wild. The math of the damage literally gives away the fraud.
Furthermore, you analyze the directionality of the strikes on those roof metals. Let's go back to our hypothesis of a west-driven storm.
Okay.
You look at a cylindrical pipe jack sticking up out of the roof. If the wind was calm, gravity pulls the hail straight down.
Like normal rain.
Right. The flat, horizontal top of the pipe jack will be covered in circular dents, while the vertical sides will be mostly clean.
Makes sense.
But if you have 60-mile-per-hour winds driving that hail from the west, the physics change dramatically. The horizontal top of the vent might only show a few glancing, stretched-out elliptical marks.
Because the hail is coming in sideways.
Exactly. But the vertical west-facing side of that metal cylinder will be hammered with deep, direct impacts. And the east-facing side.
It will be completely smooth because it's in the shadow of the wind.
Exactly. By analyzing the soft metals first, the engineer establishes an undeniable objective baseline of exactly what fell from the sky, how big it was, and what direction it came from.
Before they ever even look at a shingle.
Before they ever have to interpret the complicated subjective damage on the asphalt shingles.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because now, armed with all of that objective data, we finally look at the shingles. We are evaluating the actual roof covering. And the framework stresses that we are looking for two totally different physical forces here, wind and hail.
Right.
They leave entirely different forensic signatures. Let's start with wind. How does wind actually damage a shingle? Because in my head, I'm picturing the wind just blowing really hard against the roof and snapping it in half.
That's a common misconception. Wind does not simply push down on a roof. To understand wind damage, we have to talk about aerodynamics and Bernoulli's principle.
Oh boy, bringing out the physics terms. Break it down for me.
Think about an airplane wing. An airplane flies because the wing is shaped so that air travels faster over the top than the bottom.
Okay, I follow you.
When air accelerates, its pressure drops. This creates a low-pressure zone above the wing, and the relatively higher pressure underneath pushes the wing up. That's lift.
Okay, I'm with you. Lift makes the plane fly.
A house acts very much like a clumsy airplane wing. As horizontal wind hits the windward wall of your house, it is forced to deflect straight upward.
Because it can't go through the wall.
Right. As it crests the edge of the roof, the eaves, it rapidly accelerates to get over the slope. That sudden acceleration creates a zone of negative pressure or extreme suction right at the edges of the roof.
So the wind isn't pressing the shingles down at all. It's actively trying to vacuum them off the roof.
Precisely. And this aerodynamic uplift is not uniform. The suction forces are exponentially higher at the sharp geometric transitions of the structure.
Like where?
The eaves at the bottom edge, the wakes along the sides, and the ridges at the very top. The broad, flat center field of the roof experiences significantly less uplift.
So I'm picturing this. Wind acts like an invisible crowbar prying at the vulnerable edges of the roof, while hail is more like a handful of gravel dropped evenly from the sky.
I love that analogy. It captures the mechanics perfectly. Wind requires a loose edge to catch. So an engineer investigating wind damage doesn't start in the middle of the roof.
They start at the edges.
They start at the eaves. They gently lift the bottom edge of the shingles to check the sealant strip.
The sealant strip, you mean the glue that holds the layers together?
Yes. A properly sealed shingle shouldn't lift easily. If it lifts with zero resistance, the adhesive bond is broken. However, a broken seal alone isn't definitive proof of spone damage.
Because the glue just gets old.
Exactly. Those adhesives degrade naturally over years of thermal cycling.
So how do you prove the wind actually broke the seal?
You look for the physical fatigue of the material. When severe wind catches an unsealed shingle tab, it lifts it up and bends it backward.
Okay.
But the top half of that shingle is nailed securely into the wood decking underneath. So the shingle bends sharply right at the weakest point, which is just below the nail line.
Like bending a piece of plastic back and forth.
Exactly. And during a storm, the wind doesn't just lift it once. The wind gusts, lifts the shingle, drops it, lifts it, drops it. We call this dynamic flapping.
Flapping, that makes sense.
Over hours, this repetitive, violent bending stresses the asphalt and literally snaps the fiberglass mat buried inside the shingle. This creates a distinct horizontal crease across the top of the tab.
It actually fractures the material.
It does. An engineer will run their fingers lightly along that bending point. Even if you can't easily see the crack, you can feel the broken fiberglass mat beneath the surface. That horizontal crease, accompanied by a broken seal, is the definitive physical signature of wind damage on an asphalt shingle.
And what if you find wind damage right in the dead center of the roof, but the edges are perfectly fine? I feel like I've seen roofers point to a missing shingle in the middle of a roof and blame the wind.
If an engineer sees that, they immediately suspect an anomaly because it fundamentally violates the laws of aerodynamics.
Because of the crowbar effect at the edges.
Right. As we established, the uplift forces are exponentially higher at the edges. If the wind was not strong enough to damage the highly vulnerable eaves or ridges, it is physically impossible for that same wind field to have generated enough suction to rip a properly installed shingle out of the protected center field.
So if there's damage in the middle but not the edges, what caused it?
Usually poor installation, maybe the roofer drove the nails too high, missing the reinforced nailing zone. Or perhaps it's a localized mechanical defect, but it is rarely, if ever, a direct result of wind uplift alone.
Okay, so that's the invisible crowbar of the wind. Now, what about the handful of gravel? What does hail damage actually look like on asphalt?
We established that the ridge of the roof, the very peak, is highly vulnerable to wind. But it is also exceptionally vulnerable to hail for a completely different structural reason: tension.
Tension, like it's stretched tight.
Yes. Think about how a ridge cap is installed. The roofer takes a flat, rigid asphalt shingle and forcibly bends it over the geometric peak of the roof in an inverted V shape.
Okay, I picture that.
Because it is bent over an angle, the upper surface of the asphalt is stretched tight. It is under continuous physical tension. Furthermore, right at the very peak, there is often a slight void in airspace between the curved shingle and the solid wood decking beneath it.
Oh, so it's stretched tight like a drum head, and there's nothing solid behind it to absorb an impact.
Exactly. Because it is in tension and lacks a solid backing, its impact resistance is drastically lower than the flat shingles in the main field of the roof.
Wow.
A half-inch hailstone that might harmlessly bounce off a flat field shingle can easily puncture or fracture a tensioned ridge shingle. If you find heavy hail damage on the ridges, but the field shingles are relatively pristine, it's not a mystery, it's just the physics of tension.
But eventually, if the hail is big enough, it will damage the flat field of the roof. What does that look like? The framework uses a very specific term here, a bruised apple.
That is the most accurate tactile description for a hail impact on asphalt. When a significant piece of ice hits a shingle, it transfers massive kinetic energy. It crushes the protective ceramic granules deep into the asphalt coating or knocks them loose entirely, exposing the black, UV-sensitive asphalt underneath.
So you look for little black bald spots on the shingle.
Visual cues are the starting point, but they can be very deceiving. A blister popping from heat can leave a bald spot. The definitive test is tactile.
You have to touch it.
You have to touch it. The impact actually fractures the internal fiberglass mat. If an engineer closes their eyes and gently presses their thumb into the center of a suspected impact, it yields.
It gives way.
Yes, it feels slightly softer, slightly concave compared to the rigid, undamaged asphalt right next to it.
Wow.
It yields exactly like pressing your thumb into a dark, bruised spot on an apple. If there is no fracture, no bruising in the mat, it is generally considered a cosmetic anomaly, not functional storm damage.
That is so visceral. You can't just look at a roof, you literally have to feel it. So we've walked the ground, we've chalked the metals, we've found the flapping creases, and we felt the bruised apples. But the framework makes a massive point here.
Yes, the documentation phase.
Right, you can't just climb down, right, I saw some dents on a piece of paper, and call it an engineering report. To make it legally and mathematically defensible, you need localized statistical proof. Which brings us to the gold standard of the roofing industry, the 10-foot by 10-foot test square.
This is where we transition from observation to rigorous documentation. An average residential roof might be 3,000 square feet. You cannot practically photograph, measure, and document every single shingle. It would take days.
You need a representative sample.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you find an area that represents the general condition of the slope. You explicitly avoid the vents, the skylights, the valleys, or the overhangs because those areas have different structural stresses.
Right, keep it typical.
You take out a tape measure and you map out exactly 100 square feet, 10 feet by 10 feet.
And you mark the corners. Often, engineers use physical L brackets placed at the four corners of the square so the boundary is undeniably visible in photographs.
Yeah.
Then you must label it.
The framework says you write down the compass direction, north, south, east, or west slope, and then you write an H followed by a number, like H12.
H12, what does that mean?
That number is the definitive count. It represents the exact number of functionally hail-damaged shingles contained strictly within that 100-square-foot boundary.
But why exactly 10 by 10? Is it just because 100 is a nice round number for doing percentages?
It is partly mathematical convenience. In the roofing industry, 100 square feet is known as 1 square of material. so it translates seamlessly into estimating software for contractors and insurance adjusters.
Well, that makes sense.
But statistically, it is the optimal sample size. It is large enough to accurately capture the random spatial distribution of a hail event, but small enough that an inspector can physically touch and meticulously evaluate every single shingle inside that box without losing focus.
So the inspector gets on their hands and knees and methodically goes through it, left to right, row by row. They take a piece of chalk and they circle every hail mark.
Yeah.
But let me pose a scenario. You're the engineer. You're in the square. You find a mark that looks kind of like hail. The granules are gone, it looks suspicious, but you aren't 100% sure. Maybe a tree branch fell, or maybe it's a manufacturing defect. Do you circle it just to be safe? I mean, if I'm the homeowner, I want you to count every single scratch so my insurance pays out.
I completely understand the homeowner's perspective, but the answer is no, absolutely not. This is where the strict ethics of engineering documentation come into play.
You have to be certain.
An engineer is an impartial finder of fact. You never, ever circle an uncertain condition just to inflate a count or to appease a client.
Because you have to defend it later.
Exactly. Imagine you are deposed in a courtroom 3 years from now. A hostile attorney points to a photograph of your test square, zooms in on one specific circle, and asks, "How do you know this wasn't a bird dropping a rock?"
Oh.
You need to be able to testify based on the loss of granules, the structural fracture of the mat, the bruised apple feel, and the alignment with the directional collateral damage on the ground that that specific mark was absolutely caused by a hailstone.
If you can't articulate that, you don't circle it.
Exactly. If you cannot articulate that defense, you do not count it. A defensible inspection documents not just what was counted, but why it was counted.
That is intense. The liability is massive. Also, this framework mentions that while hail gets circled, wind marks get a horizontal line, but then it drops a bombshell. A test square is actually a terrible tool for evaluating wind damage. Why?
It goes right back to the aerodynamics we discussed earlier. Hail is a random, chaotic, statistical event that falls relatively evenly across a broad surface area. A 100-square-foot test square captures that random distribution perfectly.
But wind is different.
Wind is highly concentrated at the geometric edges of the structure.
Right, the invisible crowbar at the eaves and ridges.
Exactly. If you place your 10 by 10 square right in the dead center of the roof slope to look for hail, it is sitting in the area of lowest aerodynamic uplift.
So you wouldn't find wind damage there anyway.
Right. It might show absolutely zero wind damage, even if the eaves 20 feet away are completely destroyed. So, while you might note a creased shingle with a line if you happen to find one inside your square, you never use the data from a test square to conclude whether the roof as a whole suffered wind damage.
Wind requires a holistic edge-to-edge evaluation.
Correct.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So you map the square, you take an overall photo showing the brackets to prove the boundaries, and then you take macro close-up photos of every single circled strike showing the texture. We've found where the roof was impacted, we've proven the mat is fractured. Now what's the next logical move?
We need to track down the material that was violently displaced.
The granules.
Yes. When a piece of hail crushes an asphalt shingle, it dislodges those protective ceramic granules.
And gravity takes over.
Yes. Gravity and the accompanying rain wash those granules right off the slope of the roof and straight into the gutters.
So we are back at the edges. The framework describes the inspector literally reaching into the gutters, putting their hand into the muck to evaluate the debris.
It is entirely necessary. You have to physically feel the debris to distinguish what it is.
Because it's a mess in there.
Right. You are feeling for gritty, uniform, sand-like asphalt granules, separating them from the soft organic debris like pollen, dirt, or decaying leaves.
But wait, didn't you say earlier that roofs naturally lose granules as they age and bake in the sun? How does a pile of sand in the gutter prove a storm happened?
Context is everything here. You are absolutely right. A 15-year-old roof is going to shed granules naturally as the asphalt dries out and the adhesive bonds fail. Finding a thin, uniform layer of granules in the gutter of an old roof is perfectly normal and expected wear and tear.
So what's the smoking gun?
Volume and correlation. If you find 2 inches of fresh, brightly colored granules piled up in the gutter directly beneath the roof slope, where you just circled 30 distinct hail impacts in your test square.
That correlation is incredibly strong evidence.
Exactly. It represents a massive, sudden, recent displacement of material that aligns perfectly with your physical findings on the roof.
It's literally the debris from the crime scene.
Exactly. An engineer will collect a physical sample of those granules, photograph them resting in the gutter to establish their location, and tie that evidence directly back to the damaged slope above.
And while we were talking about gutters and edges, the framework describes a technique that sounds like something straight out of a spy movie or a CSI episode.
Oh, the parallel light inspection.
Yes. You use a high-intensity, high-lumen spotlight or flashlight on the metal fascia and siding, but you don't shine it directly at the wall.
No, shining it directly at the wall washes out the evidence. You hold the beam almost completely parallel to the vertical surface.
It's so dramatic. It's like turning a flat wall into a topographical map.
It is the exact same principle as the chalk we used earlier, but applied on a macro scale using photons instead of calcium carbonate.
I love that.
If you stand back and look at a piece of white metal fascia under the midday sun, the glare will blind you to any minor imperfections. It looks completely pristine. But if you wait for dusk, or if you take a massive spotlight and hold it flush against the metal so the light beams graze horizontally across the surface.
The shadows appear.
Yes. When that grazing light encounters a dent, even a dent that is only a millimeter deep, the lip of that depression blocks the light, casting a long, dark shadow inside the crater.
Suddenly, an entire wall that looked perfectly smooth is revealed to be peppered with impacts.
It is an indispensable technique for proving that the storm's kinetic energy extended beyond just the roof and violently impacted the vertical faces of the building.
I love the mechanics of this so much. It's so clever. But here is the thing. Physical evidence, shadows, chalk, bruised apples, that is only half the story. We have all this objective data, but the framework points out that we cannot ignore the primary witness who actually lived through the event, the homeowner.
A lot of highly technical inspectors make a critical mistake here. They adopt a mindset of, I have the math, I have the evidence, I don't need to listen to a subjective, emotional story from the resident.
Right.
But human beings are part of the environment. The homeowner was literally the only intelligent sensor on the ground when the event actually occurred.
So you interview them. The framework says you ask about the storm's intensity, the duration, what it sounded like. Did the power go out? Did they take photos? Did they take videos on their phone? Did they literally run out into the yard and put hailstones in their freezer? Because apparently people do that.
They absolutely do. It happens more often than you'd think. And from a forensic standpoint, a frozen hailstone sitting next to a tape measure, placed beside a bag of frozen peas in a GE refrigerator, is an irrefutable piece of temporal evidence.
That's hard proof.
It proves that ice of a specific dimension existed on that property.
But let me ask you this. Are homeowners really reliable witnesses during a chaotic, terrifying storm? Or do they tend to, exaggerate? It sounded like a freight train. The hail was the size of softballs. Meanwhile, you are on the roof looking at tiny pea-sized dents.
This raises an important question about the psychology of a claim. Yes, human memory under stress is notoriously unreliable, and yes, frankly, there is often a financial incentive for a homeowner to believe their house was severely damaged because they want their roof replaced.
Naturally.
That is exactly why an engineer must be skilled at interviewing. You never lead the witness.
You don't put words in their mouth.
Exactly. You don't ask, did you see golf ball-sized hail? That implants a suggestion. You ask open-ended questions. Can you describe what the precipitation looked like? How long did it last? You let them establish their baseline reality.
So you treat them as a resource, but you don't take everything as gospel.
The critical balance is treating them as an invaluable resource while rigorously cross-referencing their subjective memory against the objective physical damage.
Trust but verify.
Precisely. If the homeowner swears it rained beer balls for 20 solid minutes, but your parallel flashlight reveals absolutely zero dents on their soft aluminum siding,
The physical evidence has to win.
the physical evidence has to win. The laws of physics do not bend to human memory.
But their photos and videos, that's hard evidence. Checking the timestamp on their iPhone video, looking at the water runoff patterns in the background, seeing how the trees are bending to confirm the wind direction. It's basically crowdsourcing the meteorology.
Exactly. Which seamlessly transitions into the next vital phase, independent verification. The homeowner's word and even their personal photos are a fantastic starting point, but a bulletproof, legally defensible engineering report requires unbiased third-party validation.
You have to prove the storm existed outside of just this one address.
Yes.
So what does this all mean? It means building an airtight alibi for the storm. The framework says you dive into the internet. You go onto social media, Facebook, X Nextdoor. You type in the city, the date, and keywords like hail, wind, damage, storm. You are actively hunting for posts from neighbors from the exact day of the reported event.
And you are looking specifically for visual evidence with undeniable context. A text post from a neighbor saying, "Wow, crazy storm last night," is practically useless forensically.
Doesn't prove anything.
Right. But a post from a neighbor 3 streets over showing a photograph of a handful of jagged hailstones held next to a quarter for scale, time-stamped at 4:15 p.m. on the specific date in question.
That is gold.
That is absolute gold.
You screenshot it. You make sure the timestamp, the date, and the username are clearly visible for the record. You check the local news stations for damage reports. You pull the National Weather Service radar images. You are establishing the storm's path and intensity from multi-million-dollar satellites in space all the way down to a random neighbor's Facebook post on Nextdoor.
The immense danger in forensic reporting is relying on a single source of truth. If your entire verification is based on one localized weather station that happened to record a high wind gust at an airport 10 miles away, a rival engineer or a sharp attorney will tear your report apart.
Because the airport isn't the house.
They will argue, correctly, that the airport is not the house. The weather 10 miles away is irrelevant.
But if you stack the evidence right.
Exactly. If you have the airport weather data, plus the satellite radar imagery showing a severe red cell tracking directly over the neighborhood, plus 3 independent social media posts showing large hail from the exact same subdivision, plus the homeowner's timestamp video.
You have an undeniable case.
You have built a consistent, independent body of evidence. You have proven beyond a reasonable doubt that a storm system physically existed in that exact location with enough kinetic energy to cause the physical damage you observed on the roof.
So we have all the puzzle pieces. We walked the ground, we mapped the collateral damage, we chalked the metals, we felt the bruised apples, we documented the 10 by 10 squares, we raked the gutters, we interviewed the homeowner, and we stalked the neighborhood on Nextdoor.
That's the process.
Now we arrive at the culmination of the entire framework, compiling the defensible engineering report, and, crucially, avoiding the massive statistical errors that plague the industry.
This is where everything either coalesces into a masterpiece of forensic reasoning or completely falls apart because of sloppy logic.
Because you have to interpret the data correctly.
Right. Ray Gessner's framework explicitly warns that many inspections fail at this final stage. Not because the fieldwork was bad or because the engineer missed a dent, but because they oversimplified their conclusions or relied on rigid, outdated industry myths.
One of the myths the framework calls out specifically, and I really want to spend some time on this because it seems so prevalent, is the idea of fixed hail size thresholds. Like there's a rule of thumb floating around that says you need 1-inch hail to damage a 3-tab shingle, or you must have 1.25-inch hail to damage a heavy architectural shingle. Why is relying on those rules so dangerous in an official report?
Because real life does not happen in a sterile laboratory. Those threshold rules were developed by firing perfectly hard, perfectly spherical, laboratory-made ice balls at brand new shingles, hitting them at a perfectly perpendicular 90-degree angle.
Which never, ever happens in nature.
Never. In reality, roofs vary wildly. Think back to our discussion on aging. A 15-year-old shingle that has been baking in the sun for a decade is incredibly brittle. It has completely lost its plasticity.
Right.
A jagged, irregular 0.75-inch hailstone driven sideways by a 60-mile-per-hour wind might absolutely shatter that brittle older shingle.
But that same 0.75-inch stone wouldn't do anything to a new roof.
Correct. Conversely, a massive 1.5-inch hailstone might harmlessly bounce off a brand new Class 4 rubberized impact-resistant shingle.
So you can't just apply a blanket rule.
If an engineer writes in their report, the weather data indicates the hail was only 0.8 inches, and industry standards require 1-inch hail to cause damage. Therefore, the roof cannot be damaged. They are committing a catastrophic logical error.
Because they aren't looking at the actual roof.
They are entirely ignoring the material reality of the specific roof they just physically stood on. Your final report must explain how the unique material condition of the roof, the specific impact characteristics of the ice, and the chaotic behavior of the storm all interacted.
Wow. You can't just blindly follow a chart. You have to use your brain.
Yeah.
And speaking of using your brain, we need to talk about the statistical math. I promised we would go back to the air conditioning condenser unit.
Oh, yes. The HVAC fins.
We talked earlier about using those delicate flattened aluminum fins to estimate the size of the hail that fell.
That's right.
The framework says that if you measure a dent on the HVAC fin that is 0.6 inches wide, it generally correlates to an impact from a hailstone that was about 0.75 inches in diameter.
That is correct.
But here's the trap. The framework says that if I measure that small 0.75-inch correlated dent on the AC unit, I cannot, under any circumstances, write down in my report that 0.75 inches was the maximum size of the hail that fell on that property that day. Why not? That's the biggest dent I found.
Oh, this is one of the most critical, widespread statistical errors made in the engineering and insurance industry, and it drives me absolutely crazy when I see it in a peer-reviewed report.
I knew you'd love this part.
Yeah.
Break down the math for me. Why is it wrong to assume that's the maximum size?
It comes down to surface area and the probability distribution of a chaotic event. Let's visualize the math. A severe hailstorm passes over a house. It drops millions of hailstones. But those stones do not fall in equal proportions.
They come in different sizes.
They follow a statistical bell curve that is heavily skewed toward the smaller end.
Meaning there is a lot of small stuff and only a little bit of big stuff.
Exactly. Over the entire property, you might have 10,000 half-inch stones fall. You might have 1,000 3/4-inch stones. You might have 100 1-inch stones.
Okay.
And perhaps at the absolute extreme tail end of the distribution curve, there are only 5 massive, destructive 1.5-inch hailstones that fall on the entire lot.
Okay, I follow the curve. Mostly small, rarely huge.
Now look at the size of the targets. Your AC condenser unit is a relatively small box. It might present, let's say, 10 square feet of total surface area facing the sky.
A tiny target.
Yes. But the roof of the house presents 3,000 square feet of surface area to the sky. The roof is 300 times larger than the AC unit. Therefore, statistically, the probability of one of those 10,000 small half-inch hailstones hitting the tiny AC unit is practically guaranteed.
It's going to get peppered with the small stuff.
Right. But what about those 5 rare, massive 1.5-inch hailstones? Because the roof is 300 times larger, the probability of one of those massive stones striking the vast surface area of the roof is incredibly high.
But the probability of it hitting the AC unit.
The probability of that rare, massive hailstone managing to essentially snipe the tiny 10-square-foot AC unit sitting down in the bushes, it is statistically microscopic.
Oh, wow. I see it now. The AC unit only caught the common small stuff because it's too small of a net to catch the rare big stuff.
Precisely. If the largest dent you find on the AC unit is 0.75 inches, that absolutely does not mean 0.75 inches was the maximum hail size that fell from the sky. It means 0.75 inches is the absolute lower bound.
It proves the storm had at least that size.
It proves definitively that hail at least that large fell. But because the roof has a vastly larger surface area, the laws of statistical probability dictate that significantly larger hailstones almost certainly hit the roof, even if they completely missed the AC unit.
That is brilliant.
If an engineer writes a report saying the AC unit only showed 0.75-inch dents, therefore the 1.5-inch damage found on the roof must be fabricated or exaggerated, they are mathematically illiterate.
They just don't understand the math.
They have completely failed to understand the relationship between sampling area and impact probability.
You are using the AC unit to prove the storm actually existed at the address, but you are using advanced statistical math to explain why the roof looks significantly worse than the AC unit.
Yes. A defensible engineering report must explicitly acknowledge the limitations of small test areas. You cannot use a tiny sample size like an AC unit or even a single 10 by 10 test square to definitively cap the maximum extreme of a random chaotic distribution.
So we have to be careful with your words.
Very careful. This is why Gessner's framework heavily stresses avoiding absolute, definitive statements when dealing with incomplete data. You don't just arrogantly write, no hail damage occurred because the AC dents were small.
You explain the whole context.
You meticulously explain what you observed, what you didn't observe, and how the totality of those observations relates to the known physics and probabilities of storm behavior.
You pull every single thread together. The compass directions, the shadows on the chalk downspouts, the flapping creases on the eaves, the bruised apples in the meticulously labeled 10 by 10 square, the fresh granules in the gutter muck, the homeowner's frozen hailstone, the satellite radar data, and the surface area probability math.
All of it.
You synthesize all of it into a singular document that can withstand the intense hostile scrutiny of lawyers, insurance adjusters, and rival engineers. You are storytelling, but you are storytelling exclusively with irrefutable facts.
And if you follow this 10-step methodology rigorously, you remove the muddy waters of subjective opinion. You bring an X-ray level of precision back to a highly complex, chaotic, natural system. You prove causality.
Incredible. We went from literally standing on the lawn looking at oak trees to doing advanced statistical probability on a piece of aluminum on an air conditioner. I promise you, I am never, ever can look at my roof or my gutters or my window screens or a passing thunderstorm the same way again.
Once you understand the physics of the environment, it really changes how you see the built world. Every single surface on your house is a recording device, just waiting for someone who knows how to read it.
But I want to leave you, our listener, with one final, lingering thought. A scenario based strictly on the friction between all these meticulous steps we just outlined. Think about this paradox. What happens when the physical evidence and the independent weather data completely 100% contradict each other?
Ah, the ultimate forensic nightmare.
Let's say you do everything right. You do the 10 by 10 test square. You find classic, undeniable, perfectly circular bruised apple hail impacts on the asphalt shingles. You find the correlated dents on the soft metal vents. The physical evidence is screaming undeniably, hail hit this roof. But then you do your verification. You pull the National Weather Service radar, the meteorological reports, the local news, and the data says the storm completely missed this house by 10 miles. There was no hail recorded anywhere near this zip code on that date or any date for the past 5 years.
It creates a massive cognitive dissonance for the engineer.
Exactly. When the X-ray shows a broken bone, but the patient and the security cameras swear they never fell, which truth does the engineer believe? The data in the sky or the fractured shingles right in front of their eyes? Which piece of evidence is lying? Something for you to mull over the next time you hear thunder rolling in.
A truly fascinating problem to solve. It requires looking even deeper.
Well, we've unpacked it all. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden forensic world above your ceiling. Until next time, keep looking closely at the details.